Why am I here? Well, because of the 215,000 people that watched Tom's first review of the GWM Ute, one of you said, take that thing to the Outback. So here we are. We're here at the back of Silverton, 1,500 kilometres from Sydney. And we didn't take the easy route either. When we asked the locals at our overnight stop, would they drive the back way to Broken Hill via Ivanhoe, they said, absolutely not, that road's shit. So we did it anyway. Hundreds of kilometres of punishing dirt roads. The greatest test for our Great Wall. So the first weak point we've noticed in our week in the Outback in the GWM has to be the air conditioning. So at the moment it's only 26 degrees at 7 AM, but over the past couple of days we've seen the temps get up to about 36 and the aircon just can't quite keep up. The fan speed isn't very strong and the air temp just doesn't seem to feel like it's below 16 degrees like the AC says it is. Which brings me on to these seats, which given that they've got cooling and ventilation, it almost seems like they're destined for fan cooling. But it's not an option yet from GWM. These seats are heated only. If you leave the car in the sun for more than a couple of minutes and jump back in, these seats are piping hot to touch, which isn't exactly ideal in the Outback. Once the aircon's had some time to cool the cabin down, you really start to enjoy just how big this interior feels. We've got this big broad dash that overlooks this massive shelf of a bonnet. We've got these big comfy seats that you kind of sink into like armchairs. The center console comes and sits up nice and high, so you really do feel like you're sitting in the GWM instead of on top of it, like you might in some of its more commercial-based Japanese competitors. The only time that becomes a problem is when this shelf of a bonnet starts to impede on your visibility. Because when you start hitting some off-road terrain or these dirt highways like we're on at the moment, you really need to be able to see what's in front of you, because the front suspension in the GWM isn't great. It feels like it's underdamped and way too soft. So if you come into a big dip in the road, like a drainage rut or something, a little bit too hard, you will hit the bump stops and you're going to become quite acquainted to them if you spend some time on these dirt highways. Not only on fast driving, but that visibility also turns into a problem when you're doing some more challenging four-wheel drive tracks and stuff like we've put these things through, up over a couple of these mountains and stuff. If you're going up a hill, it's really difficult to be able to see over the bonnet and down and see what's in front of you. Back on the highway though, and the GWM does recover from those big hits pretty well, and it does recover better than it takes the initial hit, which is good to see. And that really allows you to crack on with triple-digit speeds on these dirt highways. As long as the GWM's going in a relatively straight line, it absolutely loves it. It eats up all these little corrugations and imperfections really well, but as soon as you hit something big like that, it kind of starts to fall apart. But as long as the road's fairly smooth like this one, and don't get me wrong, it's not smooth, it's corrugated, it's chopped up, but it's not big enough to unsettle the GWM's front suspension. And that's when this thing is in its element. It's more at home bombing along one of these dirt highways with pretty good refinement than it is at changing directions quickly in corners. In saying that though, the steering really comes alive on these dirt roads. I've never been in love with it in town and on tarmac highways and stuff like that. And we've got this 3-stage steering setting, which comfort and sport are pretty useless because it weights up the steering so much with this already massive steering wheel. And we've got this 3-stage switch down here on the center console that controls the weight of the steering. But sport and normal are pretty useless in my books. They're super heavy and really makes the steering feel pretty laborious. But whack it into comfort on the dirt, and a combination of the full-time four-wheel drive and the surprisingly well-tuned ESC system, and this thing's actually a bit of a hoot on dirt corners. We've got these long sweeping corners like we've got coming up here, and the GWM actually lets you have a little bit of fun. All whilst feeling very confident in doing so, which is awesome. Where that steering does become an issue again though, is as soon as you get back onto the blacktop and you start getting into these large sweeping corners that you get on the highways. As you turn the car in, the steering gets heavier and heavier. And sometimes as you get it onto the apex, the steering gets so heavy that it kind of just turns to concrete and doesn't want to let you steer any further. I really think adding a bit of car start to the alignment in the front end of this thing would really help the GWM get turned in and stay turned in mechanically, because there's only so much that the electric power steering can do. After a quick visual inspection underneath the car, nothing seems to be broken. All the bushings seem to be perfectly intact, there's no weeping or leaking from any of the shocks, and inside there's no rattles at all, which I'm actually quietly surprised with. The seat doesn't squeak, there's no interior trims rattling or shaking or vibrating around, and I'm actually quite chuffed about that. In saying that though, once we get the GWM back home from Adelaide to Sydney, we're going to get it up on a hoist and have a proper look underneath this thing. see if we've done any damage, if there's any split bushings, blown shocks, any oil leaks or anything like that, to give a true reading of how this thing has actually performed. All in all, the GWM has actually performed pretty well, and I'm mildly surprised by that. It can be a good bit of fun on these long dirt sweeping corners, and heading in a straight line on a fairly smooth dirt highway, it soaks up all the little bumps perfectly, and that rear end is super settled. So as long as you don't have to rely on that front suspension too often, which really is the GWM's fatal flaw for this sort of outback touring, I reckon it's one to look at. So there you have it. It turns out this Chinese dual cab does have what it takes to stand up to the punishment we gave it out in the outback. There's nothing bent, all the bushings look sweet, there's no oil leaking from the shocks, and the steering wheel's still pointing in the right direction. And it genuinely performs really well in most situations. However, I do think it's one strong update away from being something great, with a focus on the front end suspension and steering, and the usability of the tech inside the cabin. If you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe with the notification bell and leave a comment on what you think of the GWM and how it stood up to the Outback. Thanks for watching.